My name is Margot. I'm 34 years old, and I'm standing in a Chicago courtroom watching my parents' smug faces as they demand every single thing I own. The judge nods to the bailiff, asking him to read the complete list of my possessions they're claiming. My mother, Diane, straightens her designer suit. My father, Robert, adjusts his gold watch, both expecting to hear about valuable properties and assets. But as bailiff Marcus Washington clears his throat and begins reading, their confident smirks start to fade. Before we dive into this incredible story of family betrayal and ultimate justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more real-life stories of triumph over toxic families. Trust me, what happens when that bailiff finishes reading will leave you absolutely speechless. Let's begin this journey together. Growing up as the eldest daughter of successful immigrant parents should have been a blessing, but in my family it was a carefully orchestrated nightmare. My parents, Robert and Diane Chen, built their restaurant empire from a single food truck to a chain of 12 upscale establishments across Chicago. They were the American dream personified, at least from the outside looking in. But behind the success story was a toxic reality that would take me 34 years to fully understand and escape. From the moment my younger brother Caleb was born when I was 3, the family dynamic shifted dramatically. While I was washing dishes in the back of our first restaurant at age 14, Caleb was at private tennis lessons. When I asked for help with college applications, my parents told me I needed to learn independence. When Caleb merely mentioned wanting to study business, they immediately hired him a team of tutors and consultants. My sister Jillian came along when I was 5, and she too basked in the golden glow of parental favoritism while I remained invisible, except when there was work to be done. I started working in the family restaurant the summer I turned 14. Every day after school, weekends, holidays, I was there. My parents called it learning the family business, but I was never paid a proper wage. They'd slip me $20 here and there, always with the reminder that family helps family and that everything they built would be ours one day. I believed them because what child doesn't want to believe their parents have their best interests at heart? While my classmates were at football games and school dances, I was taking orders, cleaning tables, and closing up the restaurant at midnight. The promises were constant and specific. My father would walk me through the main dining room after closing his arm around my shoulders, painting pictures of my future. "This will all be yours one day, Margot," he'd say. "You're the responsible one, the one I can trust. We're building this for you and your siblings to share equally." My mother would nod along during family meetings discussing how the business would be divided into 3 equal parts. They even showed me documents, plans, projections. I was too young and too trusting to ask why I never got to keep copies of those papers. College was my first real test of their true intentions. When I graduated high school with honors, having managed a full course load while working 40 hours a week in the restaurant, I assumed my college would be funded like they'd always implied. After all, they'd been setting aside money for our education since we were babies, or so they claimed. The summer before I was supposed to start at Northwestern University, I sat down with them to discuss the financial arrangements. That's when the first mask slipped. "We've decided you need to learn the value of hard work," my mother announced, her perfectly manicured nails drumming on our kitchen table. "Loans and scholarships will teach you responsibility." "But Caleb is only 15, I protested. "What about his college fund?" "That's different," my father interjected. "He's pursuing business which directly benefits the family restaurants. Your nursing aspirations are a personal choice." The conversation ended with them offering to co-sign student loans, presenting this as an act of generosity. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through nursing school. Night shifts at a hospital as an aide, weekend mornings at a coffee shop, and whenever possible, still helping at the family restaurant for those pitiful $20 handouts. My parents would parade me at family gatherings, boasting about their daughter, the future nurse, taking credit for my work ethic and dedication. They never mentioned that I was surviving on 4 hours of sleep and ramen noodles while they paid for Caleb's apartment near his university and Jillian's shopping sprees. My friend Amy Kim worked at the bank where my parents did their business banking. We'd grown up together and she knew about my family situation. One day in my final year of nursing school, she pulled me aside with a concerned expression. She couldn't give me details due to confidentiality, but she strongly suggested I might want to look into the current ownership structure of the family businesses. Her words chilled me, but I trusted her judgment. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I went through the public records for our restaurant's corporate filings. What I found made my blood run cold. The ownership restructuring had happened 6 months earlier, where once the documents showed equal future provisions for 3 children, now everything was in Caleb's name, with a small provision for Jillian. My name had been systematically removed from every single document. When I confronted my parents with printed copies of the public records, their response was devastatingly casual. "You chose your own path with nursing," my father said, not even looking up from his newspaper. "The restaurants need someone committed to the family legacy. Caleb has shown that commitment. But I've worked there since I was 14, I said, my voice shaking with rage and hurt. As an employee, yes, my mother added with a dismissive wave. But ownership requires a different level of dedication. You made your choice when you decided to pursue outside interests." The betrayal cut deep, but what hurt more was Caleb's reaction when I confronted him. He shrugged and said he'd assumed I knew. "It's been discussed for years, Margot. You're too emotional about business anyway. Dad says nurses make good money, so you'll be fine." The casualness of his dismissal, the way he couldn't even meet my eyes, told me everything I needed to know about how my family truly saw me. I was not a daughter or sister, I was free labor, someone to use and discard when no longer convenient. That night I started keeping detailed records of everything. Every conversation, every promise broken, every hour worked without proper compensation. I didn't know why I was documenting it all, but something deep in my gut told me this was just the beginning. My parents had shown their true colors, and if they could betray me this thoroughly over the restaurants I'd helped build with my sweat and sacrifice, what else were they capable of? I would soon find out that my instincts were more accurate than I could have imagined. 2 years after discovering the restaurant betrayal, I thought I'd found my fresh start. I'd graduated nursing school with honors, landed a position at one of Chicago's top hospitals, and met Dr. James Fletcher during my ICU rotation. James was everything my family wasn't: kind, honest, and from a wealthy family who'd never made him choose between love and money. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, I said yes, immediately seeing it as my chance to build something beautiful separate from my toxic family. The moment my parents learned about my engagement to a successful surgeon from an established family, their attitude toward me shifted dramatically. Suddenly, I was their precious daughter again. My mother called daily, wanting to hear every detail about wedding planning. My father started introducing me to his business associates as his accomplished daughter, who was marrying into the Fletcher family. After years of being invisible, their sudden interest should have raised red flags. But I was vulnerable to the childhood dream that maybe finally I could have the loving parents I'd always wanted. My mother appeared at my apartment one Saturday morning with fabric samples and a thick wedding planning book. "Margot, darling," she said, using an endearment I hadn't heard since elementary school. "Your father and I want to give you the wedding you deserve. We know we've had our differences, but you're our firstborn. Let us do this for you." She painted a picture of a spectacular celebration at the Drake Hotel with flowers imported from Ecuador and a reception for 300 guests. When I protested that James and I wanted something smaller, she waved her hand dismissively. The Fletcher family expects a certain caliber of event, she insisted. Your father's business associates need to be included. This is about more than just you, Margot. It's about family honor, about showing that we can provide appropriately for our daughter. The way she phrased it made me feel selfish for wanting something intimate. James, sweet man that he was, said he just wanted me to be happy. If a big wedding would help heal the rift with my family, he was all for it. Within days, my mother had completely taken over. She hired wedding planner Veronica Sterling, known for orchestrating Chicago's most lavish society weddings. Vendors were booked at breakneck speed. The Plaza Ballroom for 500 guests, because 300 was now too modest. Wolfgang Puck's team for catering. A dress from Vera Wang's private collection. Every time I expressed concern about the escalating costs, my parents assured me it was handled. This is our gift to you, my father said repeatedly. Just sign where Veronica tells you to sign, and let us worry about the rest. I should have questioned why every contract needed my signature, why the deposits were coming from my credit cards with promises of immediate reimbursement. But I was working 12-hour shifts planning a wedding and trying to believe that my parents had finally accepted me. My mother accompanied me to every fitting, every tasting acting, like the devoted mother I'd always dreamed of having. She even cried when I tried on my dress, telling me I looked like the daughter she'd always envisioned. 2 weeks before the wedding, with invitations sent to 400 guests, deposits paid, and everything in motion, I arrived at my parents' house for what I thought was a final planning meeting. The atmosphere was different immediately. My father sat at the head of the dining table with a stern expression, my mother beside him looking coldly satisfied. Caleb and Jillian were there too, which was strange since they'd shown little interest in my wedding plans. We need to discuss your financial irresponsibility, my father began without preamble. What are you talking about? I asked, genuinely confused. Your wedding expenditures have exceeded all reasonable bounds, my mother added. The contracts you signed, the obligations you've undertaken. It's clear you haven't learned anything about fiscal responsibility. The room spun as understanding dawned. You said you were paying for everything, I whispered. We said we'd help guide you, my father corrected. But you insisted on the most expensive options for everything. Veronica Sterling has informed us that all contracts are in your name, all deposits from your accounts. We assumed you had the means to cover it, since you insisted on such extravagance. The lies were so smooth, so practiced, I realized they'd planned this from the beginning. My signature on everything my credit cards used for deposits with their promises of reimbursement that never came. The total came to $75,000. Money I didn't have. Money they knew I didn't have. When I looked at Caleb, hoping for some support, he actually smirked. Maybe this will teach you not to live beyond your means, he said. Jillian at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, but she remained silent. I stumbled out of their house, calling James through tears. The wedding was in 2 weeks. Vendors were expecting final payments. Everything was going to collapse. James's family offered to cover the costs immediately. His parents were horrified by what mine had done and wanted to help. But something in me broke at the thought of starting our marriage that way in debt to his family because of my family's cruelty. I couldn't do it. When I told James I needed to cancel the wedding, he tried to understand, but I could see the hurt and confusion in his eyes. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust, about bringing poison into our new life together. The cancellations were humiliating. Each vendor had to be called personally. Some were understanding, others threatened legal action. My credit was destroyed. My relationship with James, while not ended, was strained in ways that would never fully heal. He couldn't understand why I wouldn't let his family help, why I was so stubborn about handling it alone. But how could I explain that accepting their help would mean my parents had succeeded in making me a burden to his family from day one? A month after the canceled wedding, I discovered the final twist of the knife. Jillian posted photos on Instagram from her elaborate 25th birthday party. The venue looked familiar, the decorations even more so. Through a mutual friend, I learned my parents had used my wedding vendor contacts and even some of my deposits to throw Jillian's party. They'd simply transferred everything they could, claiming a family emergency required the change. Some vendors believing the sob story had accommodated the switch. When I confronted Caleb, he didn't even try to deny it. The vendors were already booked, he said with a shrug. Why waste the deposits? Besides, you were trying to social climb above your station. James's family probably realized what a gold digger you were. The casual cruelty of his words, the way he twisted the narrative to make me the villain in my own story, showed me just how deeply the family poison ran. This wasn't just favoritism or neglect anymore. This was active, deliberate destruction. I took a second job at a private clinic to pay off the wedding debt. 70-hour weeks became my new normal. My coworkers noticed my exhaustion, my weight loss, the way I flinched when anyone mentioned weddings or family. But I couldn't bring myself to explain that my own parents had orchestrated my financial ruin as some sort of twisted lesson. James tried to maintain our relationship, but the shadow of the canceled wedding hung over everything. We finally ended things 6 months later, him heading to a fellowship in Boston, while I stayed in Chicago, still paying off a wedding that never happened. 3 years after the wedding disaster, I had finally clawed my way back to financial stability. The wedding debt was paid off through brutal sacrifice. No vacations, no dinners out, no new clothes unless absolutely necessary. I lived in a studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood, saved every penny, and worked every extra shift offered. My coworkers thought I was saving for something special, and I was. I was saving for the one thing my parents couldn't take away, a home of my own. The house I found wasn't much. A 2-bedroom ranch in Oak Park built in 1952 with original everything and a list of needed repairs as long as my arm. But it had good bones, a small yard, and most importantly, it was mine. The day I closed, I sat on the living room floor and cried. Not from sadness, but from the pure joy of owning something my family couldn't touch. The seller, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, had even knocked $5,000 off the asking price because she said I reminded her of her granddaughter. I made the mistake of mentioning my new home at a mandatory family dinner for my father's 60th birthday. I'd been avoiding these gatherings, but Aunt Linda had begged me to come, not knowing the full extent of our rift. The moment I mentioned buying a house, my parents' attention snapped to me like predators scenting prey. A house, my mother said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Our Margot bought a house. How wonderful! Where is this house? What condition is it in? Against my better judgment, I agreed to let them visit the following weekend. I told myself it was just to show them I was doing fine without their help, that I didn't need their money or approval. They arrived in my father's Mercedes, both dressed as if attending a business meeting. The way they walked through my small home, touching walls, examining windows, opening closets without permission, made my skin crawl. This could be quite nice with proper renovation, my mother mused. Of course it needs everything. New kitchen, updated bathrooms, probably electrical and plumbing too. That's when my father made his move. You know, Margot, I have connections in construction. People who owe me favors. I could get you contractor rates, maybe even some work done at cost. You'd save tens of thousands. The offer was so unexpected, so seemingly generous, that I found myself considering it. The house did need work, and contractor prices were astronomical. When I expressed cautious interest, he immediately began making calls, setting up meetings, acting like the concerned father I'd always wanted him to be. The first contractor arrived the next day, which should have been a warning sign. His name was Bruno Castellano, and he walked through my house with my father, as if I wasn't even there. They discussed knocking out walls, adding a second story, expanding the kitchen into a chef's paradise. When I protested that I just needed basic repairs and maybe an updated bathroom, they both laughed. "If you're going to do it right," my father said. "Bruno here will give you a deal you can't refuse." Within a week, my house was a construction zone. I'd only authorized a bathroom renovation and some electrical updates, but somehow crews were everywhere. When I demanded to see contracts, Bruno produced papers with my signature, except I'd never signed them. The signatures were close enough to mine that challenging them would be difficult, and my father stood by Bruno's version of events. "You were so excited about the improvements," he said. "Don't you remember? You signed everything at dinner last Tuesday." I hadn't been to dinner with them in months, but they'd created a paper trail that suggested otherwise. Restaurant receipts with forged signatures, witness statements from employees who'd do anything my father asked. As the work continued, the scope expanded exponentially. A simple bathroom update became a full master suite addition. The kitchen refresh turned into a complete gut renovation with commercial-grade appliances. My protests were met with patronizing smiles and reminders that I'd wanted the best for my home. The bills, when they started arriving, were staggering. 100,000, then 150, then $200,000. All in my name, all with those forged signatures that looked just close enough to mine. When I refused to pay, Bruno filed a mechanic's lien on my property. If I couldn't pay within 90 days, he could force a foreclosure sale. The house I'd worked so hard to buy would be auctioned, and guess who was ready to buy it at a fraction of its value? My parents revealed their true intentions during another family dinner I was summoned to attend. "This house with all these improvements would make a perfect rental property for our portfolio," my father said casually. "Of course, we'd give you a fair price for it, maybe even let you rent it back from us at family rates." The cruelty of suggesting I could rent my own home from them after they'd stolen it made me physically ill. Caleb added his own twist, suggesting they could use it as an Airbnb for extra income. Desperate, I reached out to Derek Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, a lawyer who'd helped a coworker with a predatory lending situation. Derek looked at my case and immediately saw the pattern. "This isn't their first time," he said quietly. "I've seen similar cases in property records going back 20 years. Your uncle, your father's brother? He lost a commercial property the same way in 1998. The revelation that my parents had been destroying family members financially for decades shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Derek helped me negotiate a settlement with Bruno, who turned out to have his own legal troubles that made him eager to avoid scrutiny. I had to take out a second mortgage and cash out my retirement savings, but I kept my house. My credit was destroyed again, my financial future mortgaged literally and figuratively, but the house remained mine. The improvements I never wanted became a daily reminder of how far my parents would go to control and destroy me. During the investigation, Derek uncovered something even more disturbing. My parents had done this exact scheme to at least 5 other people, all family members or close family friends who trusted them. The pattern was always the same. Offer help, create fraudulent contracts, force improvements beyond the victim's means, then swoop in to buy the distressed property. They'd built a significant portion of their real estate portfolio this way, all while maintaining their reputation as successful, generous business owners. My grandmother Ruth, my mother's mother, was the only family member who ever truly saw me. While my parents played their toxic games, Grandma Ruth would sneak me $20 bills with notes saying, "For my hard-working granddaughter," or "Buy yourself something nice, sweetheart." She lived modestly despite having accumulated considerable wealth through careful investing and her late husband's insurance policies. More than money, though, she gave me something priceless, the absolute certainty that I was loved for who I was, not what I could provide. When Grandma Ruth was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I took family medical leave to care for her. My parents, who had barely visited her in the nursing home before her diagnosis, suddenly became devoted children. They insisted on moving her to their house, hiring round-the-clock nurses, making a great show of their filial devotion. But Grandma Ruth saw through it all. She asked specifically for me to be her primary caregiver, and despite their protests, she held firm. Those last 6 months with Grandma Ruth were bittersweet. Between the pain medication and the clarity that comes with knowing the end is near, she told me stories I'd never heard. How my mother had always been manipulative, even as a child. How my grandfather had wanted to leave money directly to the grandchildren, but my mother had convinced him otherwise. How she'd watched my parents exploit me over the years and felt powerless to intervene without making things worse for me. 2 weeks before she passed, Grandma Ruth called her lawyer to her bedside. She insisted I be present while my parents were specifically excluded. "I want Margot to know exactly what I'm leaving her," she said firmly. "No ambiguity, no room for interpretation." The lawyer detailed how she was leaving me her investment portfolio, worth approximately $400,000, and her collection of jewelry, including pieces from my great-grandmother. Everything was clearly documented, witnessed, and filed. Grandma Ruth died on a Tuesday morning, holding my hand and telling me she was proud of the woman I'd become despite everything. At her funeral, my parents played the role of grieving children perfectly. My mother even managed tears when speaking about her mother's generous spirit. Caleb and Jillian, who'd visited Grandma Ruth maybe twice in her final year, spoke about loving memories that sounded suspiciously generic. I kept quiet, holding my real grief close, knowing what was coming. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday. I arrived to find my parents already there with their lawyer, Mitchell Graves, a man whose reputation for bending legal ethics was well known. When Grandma Ruth's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, read the will leaving me the investments and jewelry, my mother's performance began. She collapsed into tears, claiming her mother had been confused that the cancer and medications had affected her judgment. Within days, my parents filed a formal challenge to the will. They produced medical documents supposedly signed by Grandma Ruth's doctor, stating she'd been mentally incompetent for months before her death. The signature looked authentic, but something felt wrong. They also presented witnesses who claimed I'd been medicating Grandma Ruth heavily, keeping her confused while I manipulated her into changing her will in my favor. The most devastating betrayal came from Caleb. He took the witness stand and testified that he'd heard me discussing with Grandma Ruth how to cut my parents out of the will. He claimed I'd coached her on what to say to the lawyer, that I'd threatened to stop caring for her if she didn't comply. His testimony was detailed, emotional, and completely fabricated, but he delivered it with such conviction that even I almost wondered if I'd somehow done these things and forgotten. Jillian, when called to testify, claimed she couldn't remember specific incidents but supported our parents' version of events. Her neutrality was almost worse than Caleb's lies, because it gave the false impression of objectivity. She wouldn't lie outright, but she wouldn't tell the truth either. Her silence in the face of their deception was its own form of betrayal, the coward's path that allowed her to benefit without getting her hands dirty. The judge ruled in my parents' favor. The medical documentation, the witness testimonies, and the lack of any written rebuttal from me created reasonable doubt about Grandma Ruth's mental state. The entire estate reverted to my mother as the sole surviving child. I watched $400,000 and the last tangible connection to someone who truly loved me disappear into my parents' control. The jewelry, including my great-grandmother's wedding ring that Grandma Ruth had specifically wanted me to have, all gone. The truth about the medical documents came out accidentally a year later. I was at the hospital for work when I overheard two doctors discussing a colleague who'd lost his license for falsifying documents. The name rang a bell. It was the same doctor who'd supposedly signed Grandma Ruth's incompetency papers. When I investigated further, I discovered he'd actually died 2 months before the date on the documents. My parents had forged a dead man's signature betting correctly that no one would verify it thoroughly. By then it was too late. The estate had been distributed, the money absorbed into my parents' accounts, and immediately spent on yet another failed business venture for Caleb, this time a restaurant concept that folded within 6 months. The jewelry was sold except for a few pieces my mother kept to wear at social events, showing off my grandmother's treasures while telling people how her ungrateful daughter had tried to steal them. The cruelty of watching her wear Grandma Ruth's pearls while spreading lies about me was almost unbearable. Derek Chen, who'd become my unofficial legal advisor and one of my few true friends, confirmed what I already knew. Proving the forgery now would be expensive and likely futile. The money was gone, spent, and transferred through enough hands to make recovery impossible. More importantly, it would require me to formally accuse my parents of criminal fraud, something that could destroy their business empire, but would also consume years of my life in legal battles. I chose to walk away, but not before one final confrontation. I met my parents at their office, bringing copies of everything I'd discovered about the forged documents. I laid it all out calmly, watching their faces change from dismissive to wary as they realized I knew the truth. "I could destroy you with this information," I said quietly. "But unlike you, I don't need to hurt family to feel powerful. Consider this my final gift to you, the gift of my absence." My mother tried to spin it even then, claiming they'd only contested the will to protect the family assets, that I'd proven I couldn't handle money responsibly. My father added that they'd invested the inheritance in Caleb's business for the good of the family future. Neither showed a moment of remorse for stealing from me or dishonoring Grandma Ruth's final wishes. They were so deep in their own justifications that truth had become irrelevant. After everything my family had put me through, you'd think I would have learned to stay completely away from them. But trauma has a way of making you seek validation from the very people who hurt you. So when I started my medical supply distribution business with Grace Kim, a fellow nurse who'd become a close friend, I made the mistake of mentioning it at a family event I'd foolishly attended. It was Aunt Linda's funeral, and in a moment of grief-induced vulnerability, I'd shared my good news. Grace and I had identified a gap in the market for specialized wound care supplies in smaller clinics and home health services. We'd meticulously created a solid business plan and secured a small business loan. Med Supply Solutions was born from our shared experience of watching smaller healthcare facilities struggle to get quality supplies at reasonable prices. Within 6 months, we had 12 steady clients and were breaking even with projections showing profitability by year 2. My parents' initial reaction was predictable dismissal. Medical supplies, my mother sniffed. How pedestrian. But as I inadvertently revealed more details, their interest sharpened. When I mentioned our profit margins and growth projections, my father's eyes took on that calculating look I'd learned to fear. A week later, he called with an offer to invest. "We could help you expand faster," he said. "Family supporting family." The words made my skin crawl. I refused politely but firmly, which should have been the end of it. But I'd underestimated their vindictiveness and overestimated my ability to protect myself. 2 months later, Grace and I received a cease and desist letter from my parents' attorney. The claim was that I'd stolen proprietary business information discussed at family dinners, specifically strategies for supply chain management and vendor negotiations that my parents had supposedly developed for their restaurant empire. The accusation was absurd on its face. Restaurant supply chains and medical supply chains have nothing in common. But my parents had manufactured evidence with frightening thoroughness. They produced dated notebooks with business ideas remarkably similar to our business plan. They had affidavits from restaurant employees claiming they'd heard me discussing using family strategies for my own benefit. Most damning, they had recordings from family dinners where conversations had been edited to sound like I was asking for advice on our exact business model. The recordings were the most devastating evidence. My parents had apparently been recording family gatherings for years, capturing hundreds of hours of conversations. Through careful editing, they'd created a narrative where I seemed to be systematically extracting business intelligence from them. One recording had me asking about vendor payment terms, innocent in context but damaging when presented as evidence of theft. Another had me discussing profit margins edited to seem like I was comparing their strategies to my plans. Grace was horrified when the full scope of the attack became clear. She had her own family's savings invested in the business, and the legal threats put everything at risk. Our clients, getting wind of the legal troubles, began to reconsider their contracts. 2 major accounts suspended orders pending resolution of the dispute. Our carefully built reputation was crumbling, and we hadn't even been served with an actual lawsuit yet. Just the threat was enough to destabilize everything. My parents offered a settlement through their lawyer. Drop the business, sign a non-compete agreement, and pay them a licensing fee for the supposed intellectual property I'd stolen. The terms would effectively end my ability to work in any supply chain business for 10 years and cost $50,000 I didn't have. When I refused, they escalated, filing formal charges of corporate espionage and intellectual property theft, serious enough to trigger criminal investigation. The pressure on Grace became unbearable. Her husband was concerned about their savings. Her parents worried about legal troubles affecting their own small business. I watched her anxiety increase daily as my parents' lawyers sent increasingly aggressive communications. Finally, she came to me in tears. She couldn't continue with the legal uncertainty. Her family needed stability. She offered to buy out my share of the business for far less than it was worth, just to end her involvement in the mess. I couldn't blame Grace for protecting herself. She had 2 young children and elderly parents depending on her. So I agreed to the buyout, accepting 20 cents on the dollar for my share of a business we'd built together. Watching her sign papers with relief and guilt warring on her face broke something inside me. Another relationship destroyed, another dream crushed, all because I dared to succeed without my family's permission. During the buyout negotiations, I learned through Derek that this wasn't the first time my parents had used this exact tactic. My uncle, my father's younger brother, had tried to start an import business in the 90s. The same pattern emerged: offers of help refused. Then accusations of theft, manufactured evidence, legal threats. He'd eventually fled to South Korea to escape the legal harassment, never to return. An old family friend had attempted a catering business and faced similar attacks. The pattern was clear and practiced. Louise Chen, a longtime bookkeeper for my parents who'd known me since childhood, reached out secretly through Derek. She couldn't testify openly without destroying her own livelihood, but she provided documentation showing how my parents had systematically destroyed at least 7 small businesses over the years, always belonging to people who'd trusted them. The technique was always the same: record everything, edit, creatively manufacture evidence, then attack when the target was most vulnerable. With Louise's information, Derek crafted a counter-argument strong enough to make my parents reconsider. The threat of exposing their pattern of behavior, especially with documentation, could damage their restaurant empire's reputation. They quietly dropped the criminal charges, but maintained the civil threat, ensuring I could never work in supply chain management without risking renewed legal action. The message was clear: stay in your lane, or we'll destroy you again and again. The loss of Med Supply Solutions sent me into a deep depression. It wasn't just the financial loss, though, that was devastating. It was the realization that my parents would never stop, that any success I achieved would be seen as a threat to their control. They'd rather destroy me completely than see me thrive independently. The therapy bills from this period nearly bankrupted me, but the alternative was losing myself entirely to despair. By my 34th birthday, I had rebuilt my life once more through sheer determination. I worked exclusively as a nurse, avoiding anything that could be construed as business ownership. I lived quietly, saved carefully, and maintained minimal contact with my family. So when I received a formal summons to appear in court for a lawsuit filed by my parents, I initially thought it was a mistake. The lawsuit claimed I owed them $1.2 million for costs associated with raising me, educating me, and emotional damages from my ingratitude. The itemized list attached to the lawsuit was staggering in its detail and delusion. Every meal from birth to age 18 was cataloged and priced. Birthday presents were listed as loans to be repaid with interest. They'd calculated the square footage of my childhood bedroom and charged rent retroactively. Dance lessons I'd taken at age 6 were itemized at current market rates plus 30 years of compound interest. Even the gas used to drive me to school had been calculated and included. Beyond the childhood expenses, they claimed emotional damages. My refusal to work in the family business after they'd trained me was quantified at $500,000 in lost productivity. My ingratitude for their parenting was valued at another $200,000 in pain and suffering. They even included a line item for damage to their reputation from my estrangement, though they were the ones making it public through this lawsuit. The sheer audacity of putting a price tag on parenting was breathtaking. The coup de grace came in the form of an affidavit from James Fletcher, my former fiancé. In it, he stated that I'd told him multiple times that I owed my parents everything and intended to pay them back once I was financially stable. The statement was carefully crafted to be technically true. I had said those words, but in the context of emotional gratitude, not legal obligation. But on paper, devoid of context, it seemed like an admission of debt. That James would participate in this attack years after our relationship ended felt like the deepest cut. I couldn't afford a lawyer for a case this complex, so I prepared to represent myself. The court date arrived on a gray February morning. My parents entered the courtroom with a full legal team, my mother in her most expensive suit, my father checking his Rolex repeatedly. Caleb and Jillian sat behind them, Caleb looking smug, Jillian staring at her phone. I sat alone at the defendant's table, a stack of carefully organized documents my only defense. My parents' lawyer, Mitchell Graves, again presented their case with theatrical flair. He painted a picture of parents who'd sacrificed everything for an ungrateful daughter who'd taken their generosity and thrown it back in their faces. The itemized list was presented as evidence of their meticulous care and attention to my upbringing. James's affidavit was read with particular emphasis. By the time he finished, I could see some jury members looking at me with disapproval. Judge Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s, listened to everything impassively. When it came time for my defense, I stood on shaking legs and began to speak. I talked about working unpaid in their restaurant from age 14, about being denied college funds while my siblings received full support, about the wedding disaster, the house conspiracy, the stolen inheritance. But without expensive lawyers and expert witnesses, my words felt thin against their polished presentation. Then Judge Harrison did something unexpected. She asked to see the complete list of possessions and assets my parents were claiming. Everything she specified, not just the childhood expenses, but current assets as well. Mitchell Graves seemed pleased by this, producing another document listing my house car retirement accounts, even my grandmother's jewelry they'd already stolen. They wanted everything I'd worked for, everything I'd scraped together despite their sabotage. The judge turned to the bailiff, Marcus Washington, a tall man with kind eyes who'd given me an encouraging nod when I'd entered. Would you please read the complete list of assets the plaintiff is claiming, including both the childhood expenses and current possessions she instructed? My parents leaned forward eagerly, anticipating the moment when the full scope of what I supposedly owed them would be made public record. Marcus cleared his throat and began reading in a deep, resonant voice. First item. 1 box of childhood photographs discarded by plaintiffs during renovation of daughter's bedroom. Salvaged from dumpster by defendant. Estimated value priceless to defendant, worthless to plaintiffs. My mother's face flickered with confusion. Second item. Collection of 43 handmade Father's Day cards, created by defendant ages 3 through 17. Never displayed, found in trash. Estimated value, 400 hours of child labor at current minimum wage. As Marcus continued reading, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. Item diary documenting 3,847 unpaid hours worked at family restaurant. Includes dates, times, and tasks performed without compensation. Estimated value at current minimum wage with overtime $87,000. My father's confident posture began to wilt. Item nursing degree earned without family financial support despite promises. Student loans in defendant's name $93,000. Value of parental contribution 0. The bailiff's voice grew stronger as he continued reading each item, a revelation that peeled back the facade my parents had so carefully constructed. Item medical supplies donated to homeless shelters in plaintiff's name to improve their public image. Actual donor defendant. Value $32,000 over 5 years. My mother's perfectly composed expression began to crack as board members of their charity foundation present in the gallery exchanged shocked glances. Item collection of thank you letters from 847 patients defendant provided extra care for without additional compensation. Includes 17 letters crediting defendant with saving their lives. Estimated value immeasurable. Several jurors were now leaning forward, completely absorbed. Item receipt for grandmother Ruth's final medical expenses paid by defendant while plaintiffs contested her will. Amount $43,000. The judge's expression had shifted from neutral to deeply interested. Marcus paused, adjusted his glasses, and continued with what would become the most damaging revelations. Item cancelled. Checks totaling $18,000 for Uncle Richard's cancer treatment after plaintiffs refused to help their own brother. Item proof of anonymous donations to plaintiff's church building fund, allowing plaintiffs to claim major donor status. Amount $15,000 over 3 years. My father's face had gone from red to ashen as their carefully maintained public image crumbled with each word. The list continued relentlessly. Item documentation of wedding debt incurred through plaintiff's deception. Current status paid in full by defendant through 2 years of overtime work. Amount $75,000. Item credit report showing destruction of defendant's credit rating through plaintiff's fraudulent activities. Estimated impact on lifetime earnings $300,000. Even Caleb had stopped smirking, realizing the implications of what was being revealed. Then came the evidence I hadn't even known existed. Item forensic accounting report commissioned pro bono by concerned community member showing pattern of plaintiff's financial fraud against family members over 20-year period. Estimated total damages to various victims $2.3 million. The gallery erupted in whispers as several people present recognized themselves as victims in the report. Judge Harrison had to call for order twice. Item recording devices illegally placed in defendant's home, violating state privacy laws. Criminal charges pending further investigation. My blood ran cold as I realized they'd been recording me in my own house. Item signed affidavit from Louise Chen, former bookkeeper, detailing systematic destruction of family members' businesses and financial fraud. Louise herself stood up in the gallery, having found the courage to attend despite the risk to her own security. As the list neared its end, representatives from the IRS and state attorney's office entered the courtroom quietly. Derek had warned me this might happen if the evidence of fraud was substantial enough. Item evidence of tax evasion through unreported cash transactions at family restaurants. Estimated unreported income, $800,000 over 10 years. My parents' lawyer, Mitchell Graves, was frantically whispering to them, his own composure completely shattered. The final items were the most personal. Item: handwritten letter from grandmother Ruth to defendant, expressing pride and love, hidden by plaintiffs during estate proceedings. Item: great-grandmother's wedding ring reported stolen by plaintiffs for insurance fraud after taking it from grandmother's estate. Current location: plaintiff's safety deposit box. The judge's expression had hardened into something resembling controlled fury as the full pattern of criminality became clear. When Marcus finally finished reading, the courtroom was silent, except for my mother's quiet sobbing, though whether from shame or simply being caught was unclear. Judge Harrison looked directly at my parents with an expression that could have frozen fire. This court has rarely seen such a comprehensive documentation of systematic familiar abuse, financial fraud, and criminal behavior masquerading as parental rights. She began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Not only am I dismissing this frivolous lawsuit with prejudice, she continued, but I am referring this entire matter to the Criminal Division for immediate investigation. The evidence presented suggests multiple felonies, including fraud, forgery, tax evasion, and unlawful surveillance. She turned to the IRS and state attorney representatives. I trust you gentlemen have heard enough to begin your investigations immediately. They nodded, already taking notes. Then something unexpected happened. Caleb, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, stood up suddenly. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice cracking. It's all true. Everything. They made me lie about Grandma Ruth. They destroyed Uncle Richard's business and laughed about it at dinner. They've been recording everyone illegally for years. I have proof. I kept copies of everything. The courtroom erupted as my golden child brother finally broke under the weight of our parents' crimes. Jillian found her voice too, though she remained seated. I knew about the wedding setup, she admitted quietly. They planned it for months, choosing vendors they knew Margot couldn't afford. They did the same thing to cousin Anna 5 years ago. She lost her marriage and her house. I said nothing then, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Her apology, while far too late, was at least genuine, unlike anything I'd ever heard from our parents. My parents tried to leave, but security officers blocked their exit. Their empire built on the destruction of others was crumbling in real time. Mitchell Graves distanced himself immediately, claiming he'd been deceived about the nature of the case. Within hours, news of the courtroom drama had spread through Chicago's business community. Reservations at their restaurants dried up overnight. Business partners pulled out of deals. The house of cards they'd built on others' suffering was finally falling. I spoke briefly before leaving the courtroom, addressing not just the judge but everyone present. I never wanted their money, I said, my voice steady, despite years of pain behind it. I wanted parents who loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. Every dollar they stole, every relationship they destroyed, every dream they crushed, it was all because they couldn't stand to see me succeed on my own terms. I chose freedom over revenge, integrity over their twisted version of family. I hope others here today make the same choice. In the months that followed, the full extent of my parents' crimes came to light. The IRS found massive tax fraud. The state attorney charged them with multiple counts of fraud and forgery. The illegal recordings led to privacy violation charges. Their restaurant empire was seized to pay back taxes and penalties. Caleb and Jillian testified in exchange for immunity, revealing even more victims than we'd known about. My parents, who'd spent decades destroying others to build their wealth, lost everything. I used the small settlement I received from the civil suits to establish the Family Financial Abuse Foundation. We help victims of familiar financial manipulation find legal resources and emotional support. Louise Chen became our first office manager, finally free from my parents' control. Grace Kim rejoined as a board member, our friendship restored now that the threat was gone. Even some of my cousins and other relatives who'd suffered in silence came forward, finding healing and shared truth. The foundation grew quickly, perhaps because family financial abuse is more common than people realize. We've helped hundreds of victims recognize the patterns, document the abuse, and find paths to freedom. Every success story heals a piece of what my parents broke in me. When victims thank me for creating a place where they're believed and supported, I think of Grandma Ruth and know she would be proud. As for my parents, they were sentenced to federal prison for tax evasion and state prison for fraud, sentences to run concurrently. They lost their home, their businesses, their reputation, everything they'd valued more than their children's well-being. I visited them once, not for reconciliation, but for closure. They still couldn't admit wrongdoing, still blamed me for their downfall. I left that prison visiting room truly free for the first time in my life. Today I own my little house in Oak Park outright. I continue working as a nurse, finding purpose in healing others. The foundation takes up my evenings and weekends, but it feels like purpose, not work. I'm in therapy, slowly learning to trust again. Sometimes Jillian joins me for coffee, both of us working to build a relationship outside our parents' toxic influence. Even Caleb has reached out seeking his own redemption through community service. The Bailiff's list, which Derek had helped me prepare for exactly this moment, became something of a legend in Chicago legal circles. Marcus Washington told me later it was the most satisfying document he'd ever read in court. That moment, when my parents' greed led them to demand an accounting of everything, only to have their crimes read into public record, was poetic justice of the highest order. They'd wanted to take everything from me, but in the end, they only revealed everything about themselves. I learned that family isn't about blood or obligation or financial entanglement. It's about love, freely given support without conditions, and the grace to let each other grow into who we're meant to be. The family I've built through shared healing and mutual support is worth more than any inheritance. And that's the greatest gift. My parents never meant to give me the knowledge that I was always enough just as I am, without their approval or their money or their twisted version of love. What would you do if your own family saw you not as a person to love, but as a resource to exploit? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-preservation? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph over family adversity. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that they're not alone in dealing with toxic family dynamics. Thank you for joining me on this journey of truth and healing. And remember, you deserve love that doesn't come with a price tag attached. Until next time, stay strong and trust your worth.